much, Henry. I think everything seems to be working. I'll try to touch no buttons. And anyway, I love plants, and trying to identify them is a way I can get close to them. I'm always challenged and interested to be able to identify plants from a distance, and that requires resolving groups of plants and looking at them in context, such as the beach sunflower, Helianthus debilis in the foreground, such as in the upper left, you see an area of sea grape, Coccoloba uvifera, and then a little bit to the right center, there is a beach tea, which is Euphorbia punctata, and there are a few other species here. I'm going to try to advance to the next slide, and hopefully this is going to work. You should be able to see a title slide, and there are three things that are really important about identification of plants. One is to practice. Like with a lot of skills, the more you do it, the better you get. And if you're curious and you want to get a little reward, maybe to identify something correctly, it helps reinforce your learning. It helps both your Gestalt identification as well as your technical identification. And I'll get into detail which is which. It's very important to understand misidentification because we often try to rush to get the right answer to something, and oftentimes it's the wrong answer. There are really two parts of identification: recognition and naming. I won't be talking too much about how to get the name for a plant because recognizing is usually the first step. But briefly, there are two best websites for us for plant scientific names. And if I want to make sure I have the right name for something, both of these, if it's a Florida plant, will give the same answer. One is Plants of the World Online, which is a Kew website, a Kew Botanical Gardens. And the other is the Atlas of Florida Plants, which is hosted by the University of South Florida. So you could just Google Atlas of Florida Plants or Plants of the World Online. And I'm not going to show you how to use these websites, but they're really powerful tools. I also have a number of YouTube videos, particularly for my native plant class, which is one of the 15 plant identification. I've taught both landscape plant identification, native plant identification at Miami-Dade County 15 times. And those are videos that should help you. If you're studying for certification for Florida Nursery Grower and Landscapers Association or for other purposes, it's always good to have a list to start from. Although this is a very small list, there are books and books representing literally thousands of plants that grow wild here in Florida, and then probably tens of thousands of other plant species. So it's good to have a framework or a list to work from. And I'll be talking about Gestalt identification, but it goes along with technical identification. Gestalt is the easy and quick way we recognize the people we know instantly without thinking, as well as familiar objects and plant species. Repetition and reinforcement are the key. So if you see a lot of people a lot of the time, you get really good at recognizing them, typically by their face. You may not always remember their name, but the first step, of course, is to recognize people as well as with plants. And it is something that is very instinctive. The baby learns quickly who its mother is and who its father is. And there's reinforcement that goes with that through repetition, and it's just second nature. Now, most of us that spend most of our lives in urban areas, we see plants occasionally, but it's not necessary for our survival to know what is poisonous and what is healthy to eat because we get most of those at the grocery store. Here is an example of Gestalt identification. Here's a tree species that has this sort of filigree pattern of the leaves. And we would know that this is Filicium decipiens, which is the sometimes called Japanese fern tree. And it has this fern because it has pinnately compound leaves. I'll look at that a little bit more in detail. But from a distance, you get this pattern, this texture. The eye sees this repeating pattern and recognizes this quickly without even thinking about the fact that the leaves are pinnately compound. Here's a tree that, to me, that looks kind of creepy because it has these sort of wavy margins on the leaves. They dangle down like something out of some Dracula or some horror story. It just, to me, it looks really creepy. And here's the tree as a whole, and it's called the mast tree. It's not common, but you see there's something that is evocative about the feeling of the northern woods and maybe Little Red Riding Hood and things like that. I don't know. You may, in your mind, have a different reaction to this. And I think the scientific name is Monun longifolium. But that's not so important as recognizing it. This is a plant we see every day in Florida. And you'll see it has kind of pointy tips that are pointing upwards and they're kind of clustered in groups. And so it has a particular kind of spiky, spiny look from a distance. And up close, we can see a bit of clustering of the leaves. This is the green buttonwood. And I'll come back again to this one again, but you'll notice that clustering of the leaf tips. The whole family, the Combretaceae, that includes the green buttonwood, Conocarpus erectus, includes a species that we now put in the genus Terminalia. It is a black olive, Terminalia bucerus. You'll notice again that sort of little clustering of the leaves on the tips of the twigs. And this is fairly characteristic of this family. It's something that is a descriptive characteristic that you probably wouldn't see in a plant book because it's vague and hard to pin down. Here's another one. This is actually another Terminalia. This is Terminalia catapa. You would typically see this as having fairly broad leaves. It might be hard to identify unless you kind of know what you're going to look for. And there are on other branches of this, actually at the lower left, you might see some young fruits are developing. This is in the same family, Combretaceae, and has that clustering. Here's a plant which is very familiar to us that we would just almost instinctively pick out because of the reddish smooth bark that's kind of peeling. And see this all over the place. It's Bursera semiruba. We don't pay attention to the fact that it's got alternate pinnate leaves. They're not terribly distinctive. It doesn't have a distinctive fruit, doesn't have a distinctive flower. So it's a plant that we would want to identify just through, we see it all the time, we know what it is. It's not always reddish. The smooth bark can sometimes be silvery. And so I've just gotten used to seeing this. And my quick-minded way, or at least the fast part of my mind that isn't necessarily the most skillful part of my mind, I want to put a name on it. Boom, Bursera semiruba limbo. Now here's a trunk of a tree that I actually, in fact, immediately thought was gumbo limbo. And I really was thrown off by that because, and this is at Montgomery Botanical Center, the name was on the tree, Calvillia racemosa, in the family Leguminosae or Fabaceae, not at all related to the gumbo limbo. So how did I get that wrong? Here are the leaves of the Calvillia racemosa. Notice that they're bipinnate, whereas the leaves of the gumbo limbo are only pinnate. So how could I get this so wrong? It was the fast part of my brain that was thinking, I want to get the right answer. I want to get my reward by knowing I got it right and I got it wrong. Here's another example, Acer rubrum, red maple. We know this because, maple leaf forever, the national flag of Canada. It's a very distinctive lobed leaf. I saw this group of leaves on another plant. This was in Orlando. And I said, oh, looks like a red maple. It's got that lobed appearance. And then I looked a little bit further, and by coincidence, growing next to it was on the left red maple, and on the right, I realized that the plant was liquid ambar styraciflua sweet gum. You would know that because if it has fruits at the base of the tree, there are these spiky little fruits that children sometimes like to color for Christmas. It very distinctive, very different from the red maple once you look at it. Here's a case of a technical characteristic that's necessary to resolve the problem created by the Gestalt. The Gestalt for me, got this one wrong. If we look at these more carefully, we'll notice there's a technical characteristic of the red maple, which is the underside of the leaf is silvery gray. And I also probably should have noticed that the leaf arrangement of the red maple should be opposite, and that of the sweet gum is alternate. But it's kind of sometimes hard to see the leaf arrangement in there, the base of the leaves in among the leaves. So I ignored that and I just jumped to conclusions. Another technical trait that would distinguish the red maple, Acer rubrum, is that when it's in fruit, it has these beautiful, often reddish fruits. I've never seen any quite as bright colored than this before, but typically there will be a winged fruit. Now, there, therefore, are two different ways to identify things, Gestalt versus technical. And I try to compare these to the concepts in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he elucidated how we come to the wrong conclusions many times with our fast thinking, which I'm using the word Gestalt for the fast thinking. You see a person, you know who they are, you've seen them a million times, you know their name maybe. And so as an example of the failures of the fast thinking part of the brain, which is valuable to us, but it needs to be validated, is the bat and ball problem. Almost everyone gets this one wrong. If a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Now, I want you to read that and think about that for a minute and see if you can come up with the right answer. This will be your Gestalt. This is your quick thinking part of your brain. I did this. Friends of me have done this. And invariably, we say that the ball costs 10 cents because we subtract the dollar from the $1.10 and we get 10 cents. That should be the price of the ball. Mm-hmm. But is that true? Not really. Because then if you add the cost of the dollar for the bat and the ball is 10 cents, we got $1.10. But that isn't the question. The question tells us that the bat and the ball cost $1.10 in total, but it doesn't give us a direct answer to the price of the ball. We would have to mathematically write this on a piece of paper and look at it and use a slow thinking, more technical part of our brain to realize that if there's $1 in difference between the price of the bat and the ball plus the bat, the bat has to cost $1.05 and the ball costs 5 cents. That's how we get up 110. Look at that and try it again. And there's a million other examples in Daniel Kahneman's book about mistakes that people make in estimation and coming to quick thinking solutions to problems. But let's go ahead and talk about Gestalt Plant ID. It's a German word. I think it was invented in 1923, and it's often been used in psychology and philosophy. And in plant identification, I'm using the word Gestalt to refer to the wholeness of form, a perception that may be hard to put into words. For example, this is a maple leaf because the first thing that comes to mind, I can't tell you why, I just know it. Or you see a friend on the street, you think, well, I don't know if that person has a beard or glasses or long hair or short hair, but it's my friend. I would recognize him anywhere. The advantages are that it's easy to learn things through Gestalt because it's loosely structured and it works well in practice. It's often called sight recognition, and it's accurate within a limited context. But the disadvantage is that it's not verifiable without going into slow technical identification to find the errors. Now, I'm going to talk through examples of what is technical plant ID, but briefly, it uses the parts of the plant, their color, size, shape, and relationship that can be described in words. And it has disadvantages, which is it's slow, it's difficult to learn, many terms to memorize, and it emphasizes visual appearance, not the other senses, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. What about the smell of different plants? We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, basically, a good technical characteristic for woody plants, dicotyledons, is leaf arrangement. The leaves on the plant on the left are arranged alternate, the ones on the right are opposite. If you can look in behind the foliage, that should be obvious. And then we could go beyond that to talk about leaves that are simple, palmately compound, pinnately compound, and bipinnate. Those are all very powerful tools. And between the leaf arrangement and the leaf division, we can often narrow down the possibilities greatly. And we can sometimes eliminate possibilities and correct errors. We can use technical characteristics in a dichotomous key. Here, the first question is, are the leaves needle-like, which could be pines and conifers, or are they not needle-like? And if they're not needle-like, are they pleated, which would be the palms, they broadleaf, which would be the dicots? And then ask other questions. Are they compound? Are they simple? But we don't necessarily have all the time in the world, and we want to come to quick, fast answers. Now, I'm going to be talking mostly about trees, and depending on your point of view, the Florida state tree, the sabal palmetto, may or may not actually be a tree. But let's just see if there's gestalt as well as technical characteristics that help us resolve this. You'll notice that it has a sort of lollipop look from a distance. You'll notice that license plate of the state of South Carolina, it's just a very remarkable shape. I guess that's more gestalt. Notice how the base of the leaves, the petioles are split, and I might have a close-up that will show that better there. So that's a good technical characteristic, which would eliminate many other species of palms. It's also it's a fan palm, and has another characteristic that's really important, which is a technical characteristic, which is the costa, and that is the extension of the petiole into the blade. And although we don't necessarily look at that very much, it has an impact on the gestalt, because when we look at the sabal palm from a distance, that costa forces the midrim of the leaf to turn under to create kind of a messy look, quite frankly, from a distance. The sabal palm on the left, it's a little bit messy, whereas many other species that don't have a costa have a very flat look, and the gestalt would tell you differently. So those are some characteristics. There are other technical characteristics. The petioles lack spines or other armament, but that's not terribly good, because sometimes with a very tall sabal palmetto or a very tall Washingtonia, we can't see the spines on the petiole. Here's a, excuse me, there's another sable palmetto showing the kind of messy look from a distance. Now, here are the spines that you will not see on sable palmetto. This is a Washingtonia robusta. That's a technical characteristic. But if you've got a tall tree, how are you going to tell the difference? And it's tough. Well, one thing is that the Washingtonia robusta leaves are shiny. And I don't have a super good picture, but when I'm driving on I-95, I see Washingtonias from hundreds of feet away. I know instinctively that those are Washingtonias and not sables. Here's a somewhat fuzzy picture that shows Washingtonia fronds, a little bit shiny. That's a great picture. So Gestalt Plant ID is very helpful in special situations when you're looking at things from a distance, or if its plant is growing in a familiar context or environment. If it's moved somewhere else, you might not recognize it. Or if you travel to another state or country, plants, their look is going to be different and the context is different. But Gestalt is really good for close-up work as well as distance work in the same environment. It involves the break rhythmic patterns and involves characteristics such as a sound, touch, smell, and taste that cannot be conveyed by photographs. Why would I say sound? Well, if you've ever heard the rattling of bamboo at night in the wind, you'll know you could put a species or at least a subfamily descriptor on that just from the sound. What about um, uh, I'm going to pass over this. I'm sorry. So these are examples of seeing species from a distance. In the center, there is a paradise tree that would be identified because of its shiny leaves. Upper left is a Pinus eliadii. It has those needle-like leaves. There's a sable palmetto on the lower left. It's got that messy, dangling look of the fronds. On the far right, and I don't think I know if I can, this is a bipinnate leaf Lysoloma lactosiliquum. From a distance, it's got very tiny leaflets. It just, kind of filigree. And then the understory down at the bottom is a mown stand of Stenotaphyrum secundatum. So we can identify those even from a distance. What we're doing visually is we're both consolidating areas of similar pattern and we're identifying or at least locating that as a plant. And then our eyes are trying to work with our brain to figure out if there's familiar patterns. Now, here's another example of plant species seen from a distance. The Livistona chinensis on the far left, technically it's got spines on the petioles, but you have to get underneath it to see them. And there are some other things that would stand out, both technical. It typically has a large olive-shaped fruit that is sort of grayish in color. And it is a caustic palm, but it doesn't have the split petiole bases, so that would be identified more through technical characteristics than Gestalt. The Ficus microcarpa, which is a hedge identified in the lower left, is very similar from a distance to the Heredia microphylla. Those are two that cannot be distinguished except normally by looking at them really close. The Ficus microcarpa might look a little bit more shiny. Now, the Dolonox regia is a species we see all the time in South Florida, and that's easily recognizable from a distance because of the sort of filmy pattern of the bipinnate leaves. So there's a technical characteristic that gives kind of a reticulate pattern. Ceiba speciosa, silk floss tree, nothing remarkable of that until you get up close and you'll see the thorns on the trunk. Cocoloba uvrifera, that's easy to see from a distance because it has these large plate-like leaves. So can Gestalt be prescribed? Probably not, because once you put a word description on a trait, it can stop being Gestalt. It starts being technical. And that is difficult and borderline for certain things like fragrances. Here's an example of a test of 4 different subjects as to the smell of 5 different species of plants. And you notice that we could describe the smell of these 5 different plants, but no 2 people are going to come up with the same answer. And people are very suggestible. If you'd say, oh, it smells, and I've done this with my students, one person will say the Piper auritum smells like anise. Everyone else is going to say anise. The Myrcianthes fragrance, which is Simpson's stopper. I typically say this is a camphor smell. Notice that the vocation of the different people has a big effect on how they describe the smell. The artist and poet on the right said that the Piper auritum smelled like coast rocks, and that the Rudolphus sagatum smelled like wet morning. So that is pretty amazing. You know how a person's state of mind, their vocation, as well as things have been suggested to them. It just people are very weak in fragrance detection and finding names. But you may smell the same thing and you may recognize it because you smelled it before, but you can't put a word on it that's going to help anybody else identify that plant by smell. So I want to talk a little bit about how fast thinking, jumping to conclusions, Gestalt identification can be verified. And for this, we have to use the technical descriptions. And I'm not saying get away from Gestalt, but use it in its place and then try to verify through the technical descriptors of what a plant is. And I mentioned it as authoritative sources, the Plants of the World Online and the Atlas of Florida Plants. Here's a good example of 2 things that look very similar from a distance as far as their leaf. The one on the left is pretty shiny. The one on the right is pretty shiny. Both are large trees with alternate pinnately compound leaves of similar sizes with asymmetrical leaf bases. Here's where technical traits help us enormously. The Bursera cimaruba on the left has a odd pinnate leaf. The Swietenia mahogany, or West Indian mahogany, has an pinnate leaf. And you'll notice too that the at least with the mature specimens of the mahogany on the right, the base of the leaf is very, very asymmetrical, more so even than the cimaruba on the left. So those are some examples. Another that people get wrong very commonly is Lysoloma laticilicum versus Lysoloma sabacou. The sabacou on the left has a white puffball flower and bipinnate leaves. On the right, the Lysoloma laticilicum and the wild tamarin also has a white puffball inflorescence. They really look similar, and people get this wrong very commonly. You would use, in that case, the technical characteristic of the bark to distinguish the sabacou on the right with the very kind of large peely bark, and the smooth bark on the wild tamarind on the left. That'll be true until the wild tamarind gets to be a very, very big tree. Then it will start to have kind of shaggy bark. Here's an example of a planting of sabacou along Kane Boulevard near the Paris Art Museum. And I suspect that these and many other plantings were intended to be the Lysoloma um, latissilicum because it is a native and the sapling is not a Florida native. I want to mention briefly AI or artificial intelligence and the enormously powerful tools that we have for at least getting a clue to identification. I think that these tools are much like Gestalt identification because we don't necessarily know how they work, and they sometimes come up with the wrong answers some of the time in the same way that people do. They're a good first step, and I don't hesitate to use any of these to help my identification, but always verify. Here's an example of a plant at the Miami-Dade College Landscape Technology Nursery. And I took a picture of this and put it into, I think this was PlantSnap, and it told me that it was sea grape. And you could see that would be a reasonable conclusion. It's got these broad, roundish leaves, sea grape, Coccoloba ovifera. But let's take another closer look at that plant and look at the leaves. They're not really even leaves, they're leaflets. They're trifoliolate leaflets. I don't know if my pointer works, but the kind of lower right there, you can see um, there are leaflets, not leaves. And how could you get that wrong? Because that is definitely not um, sea grape, which is what the artificial intelligence said it was. It's actually a, a species in the Umbelliferia, the Poliscius, I think Balfouriana it's a shrub. So if artificial intelligence gets it wrong, and Gestalt is probably also going to get it wrong. So let's look at traits and characteristics that sort of cross the line. The cocoa plum, it has alternate simple leaves. And let's take a closer look. Notice that the leaves are organized on the stem, all kind of pointing upwards. They look very pinnate from a distance, but this sort of orientation of the leaves is a gestalt type of characteristic. There are so many plants with alternate simple leaves that it'd be hard to use that as a technical characteristic. But look at the angle and the somewhat roundedness. The leaf shape can go from ovate to obovate to elliptic to various descriptors, but they're all roundish. And that would be kind of more of a gestalt look. They look like coins to me, like silver dollars or something in size and shape. Now, if you had fruit, that'd be a technical characteristic, that'd be good. The live oak is a good example because there are many other species of oaks, but the live oak is one that has very broad horizontal limbs. And in addition, it would have a bark. Notice here are three examples of Quercus virginiana live oak bark and one example of Quercus laurifolia, laurel oak. Now, if you were to try to describe the live oak bark, it would be hard because they're not the same from one tree to the next. They all have deep ridges and high and ridges and valleys, but they're also sort of block-like. All three of those are about 3-inch blocks. The Quercus laurifolia, the third from the left, it doesn't have a smooth bark, but it's not deeply ridged and it doesn't have deep crevices either. So by leaves, you have a hard time identifying Quercus laurifolia, partly because Quercus leaves are so variable from leaf to leaf. Here's another example, not the same sample, but deep crevices and high ridges. And that's Quercus virginiana. You could also, if you had the fruit, tell the difference between these as well. A technical trait is that the live oak has a very grayish underside to the leaf, whereas the laurel oak, not so much. It's usually just plain green. Here are other species of trees. I took these at Treetops Park a few days ago. Notice the Swietenia mahogany, the West Indian mahogany on the far right. It has a very sharp and rough bark, and it certainly has ridges and crevices, but the ridges are more flat topped. They're not platy like the Pinus eliottii, the slash pine on the far left, but they spread, unlike the live oak. Dolonax regia, Royal Poinciana, flamboyant, second from the left, a very smooth bark. Bischoffia javanica varies a bit. It's got narrow ridges. Here are some others. I'll come back to Conocarpus erectus in a moment because it's an interesting example. Notice that the terminalia catapa, tropical almond, the ridges are flat-topped, and I've seen that on several specimens. Terminalia bucerus, black olive, most of the specimens that you'll see, the trunk will have rows of horizontal holes or horizontal rows of holes. I'm assuming this is perhaps caused by a woodpecker or some other pecking bird. Very common. Most of the trees have this, and most of the other trees don't. We certainly know Dolonax regia, Royal Poinciana, by its bright flower, but a lot of times it's not in flower, and it has very dramatic bipinnate leaves, which you would probably see that from a distance as sort of this filmy gossamer look. But when it's not in leaf, we have an even almost better trait, which is the long pods, typically about 70 up to about 70 centimeters long. And it gives an interesting look when it's leafless. Now, I'm going to close in a minute, so there'll be time for questions, but the buttonwood Conocarpus erectus, both the green buttonwood and the silver buttonwood, get their name from the inflorescences that look like little buttons. And I see there's someone in the waiting room. Okay. But most of the time we don't see that. Here along Miami shores is a row of green buttonwoods. So how would you know these from Gestalt? What would tell you these are green buttonwoods? Well, for one thing, the scars of the leaf, scars of the twigs and branches often are blackened, as well as the fact that the trunk tends to twist, and it's got those little acute leaves. And from a technical point of view, the way you can nail this one, it has domatia, or little tiny holes at the base of the leaf axils on the lower leaf surface, as well as on the far right at the petiole. There are two nectaries. They're reddish in color, and probably the domatia are maybe those are little homes for little animals. I'm not quite sure if they come into play, but they may serve a purpose. Even with the silver buttonwood, if you can find a young leaf, you'll probably that's not fully covered with hairs, you'll probably see these. So those are some examples of both technical characteristics and Gestalt characteristics. And we probably shouldn't say characteristics, because Gestalt is more of a sense or just a concept of what something is. We should look for every part of the plant. And if you love plants as I do, you'll discover new things if you look at them closely, whether it's purpose of identifying them or just appreciating them. So I want to preserve some time for questions. So I'm going to just stop talking about Gestalt and technical plant identification. Be happy to answer any questions.
Anybody had a question for Dr. Busey?
Yes, I have a question.
Yep. Go ahead, please.
So, So why the name Gestalt, which sounds like
Mm.
complicated and intellectual, when it's such a experience-based and intuitive a way of identifying? I'm just curious because I expected Gestalt something like really brainy, but
Well, if you can find a word that is suitable for you to describe the fast thinking, error prone, instant identification, that's fine. We used to say sight recognition. That it means that nothing really. I mean, other than the fact we're using our eyes, uh, but maybe instant recognition should be an easier term. But Gestalt was used, as I mentioned, starting in 1923 by a German writer. And you'll find it more in the psychology and philosophy literature. Uh, and you can use another name for that.
All right, AD, you have a question?
Yeah, Dr. Busey, is it true that laurel oaks are in the red oak family? And that's why they don't hybridize with live oaks and the white oak family?
Um, that's a little out of my territory. Both are in the same family, Fagaceae, and a genus Quercus that has
Right.
about 300 species worldwide. There are many interspecific hybrids, and I don't know if any of those include Quercus virginiana live oak or not. There are many cultivars and variations. Seedling oaks tend to have very different looking leaves than the mature oaks. So it's to me, it's kind of a muddled mess. But I think the live oak is 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 pretty well defined, except on the perimeter where there are interspecific hybrids. Now, the laurel oak, which has been recognized in landscape trade for decades, is very hard to find around here. If you look at the Atlas of Florida plants, you'll find that there's very few herbarium specimens of that in urban southeast Florida, and there's at least half a dozen other oaks that could come as far down as central Florida. But as far as I know, only the laurel oak and the live oak would be naturally present in Miami-Dade County. So I didn't answer your question, but I stumbled as well as I could.
That's close enough. I'm told that the laurel oaks are part of the red oak group because of the arrangement of the fruit, but I'm not sure. So,
I can't distinguish red oaks from white oaks. I know in temperate areas we would make a big deal about red oak
hmm.
versus white oak, and so if that's a taxonomic group, it probably is a subfamily, I would guess.